Day 2 of the symposium was led by the Pacific Risk Management Ohana, or PRIMO, an organization based in Hawaii that brings people together to help Pacific Island communities become more resilient to the impacts of natural hazards. Led with opening remarks by Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenorio, the keynote address was presented by Kobe Stanton, Director of Readiness from FEMA Region 9.
At this time, I'd like to introduce our host of the symposium, our Director of the Bureau of Statistics and Plans, Mr. Tyrone Taitado.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for here attending the second day of the 6th Annual Assembly of Planners Symposium. Yesterday was a very successful day. Total in-person registration exceeded 140, and online Zoom registration was above 70. And for today, the in-person registration is maxed out at the 200-person mark, and we have also a big list of Zoom registration to participate. So we're looking forward to a very interesting day. At this juncture, I also want to again extend our appreciation to all those involved in helping this happen. In particular, our federal partners like the Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA, and the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which funds the Guam Coastal Management Program within the Bureau. It was represented locally by Maria Young, and without whose support this would not be possible here. Of course, the work on this symposium was centered on Edwin Regis and his team in the Guam Coastal Management Program, but all the employees of the Bureau of Statistics and Plans in one part or another have helped and are still helping today in this event. So I want to thank them especially for all their hard work. As I said, there were a number of federal partners that helped support this event, but also the support of the American Institute of Architects, who produced a segment of the program yesterday that also provided continuing education credits for our architects who were attending that event. And today, of course, we would not have had a second day of the symposium if not for the involvement of PRIMO and then in today's activities which center on natural disaster recovery. As a matter of fact, it comes at a very important time because it also centers on a lot of work ongoing with not only the Bureau but a number of our government agencies. Our next speaker has a background that's particularly relevant since in a previous incarnation, when I really first got to know him early on in the years, when he was Deputy Chief of Staff to the Governor, and he also was the GAR. That stands for Governor's Authorized Representative, and in the parlance of disaster recovery funding, he's the key point person to manage federal disaster recovery money. So he brings with it a wealth of expertise regarding that subject matter here. You know, I've known our next guest for many years, and those of us who've known him over this period of time have always known that Joshua Tenorio was going to go far. And it's because of the sort of qualities he brings to everything he does. He has, although he's not our island's youngest lieutenant governor, he still brings the energies of youth and an intelligence and a focus on detail, which has helped him in the number of positions he's held, both in the private and public sector. And his positions in the public sector, as I said, included as Deputy Chief of Staff and as the GAR, but also as head of the judicial branch, as the administrative head of the judicial branch. And it also, you know, there's one quality about the Lieutenant Governor that's always stood out to those who have known him, is that he actually cares. There are people who go through life and just do their jobs, and there are people who give a damn about doing their jobs right. And whatever position he's ever held, he's always cared about the job doing right, and particularly with a position of public service, to do what can be done to help make lives better for the people for which whatever position you're appointed to is intended to be directed towards. And it's because of those core principles of commitments and competence and compassion. This is why when our then candidate Lulian Guerrero picked him to be his running mate, it was more than just a political announcement. It was also signaled by then candidate Lulian Guerrero about what kind of governor she wanted to be and what kind of administration she wanted to create and run if elected governor, and that it would be it was reflected in her choice of a running mate and the core principles of competence, commitment, and compassion. And for that reason, for those of us who were then asked to asked to join the administration under the leadership of Governor Leon Gurl and Lieutenant Governor Tenorio, it has been more than a job, but it's been a privilege because of the way they've approached their job and the direction they've given us. And so with that, I would like to introduce, to give opening remarks for the second day of the 6th Annual Assembly of Planners Symposium, our Lieutenant Governor, Joshua Tenorio.
Thank you, Ty. By the way, you forgot that I was Director of Bureau of Planning at one time, 20 years ago. Yikes. So good morning, everybody, and it's really good to see a lot of people in person. The last year and a half, more than a year and a half, we've been communicating a lot in Zoom. Maybe that might be a little silver lining because it seems to be pretty good for us to try and accomplish so many things that space and time sometimes are limiting. But thank you very much. And I also want to thank the Pacific Risk Management Ohana or PRIMO for partnering with the Bureau of Statistics and Plans and making this agenda very possible. And I'm really excited that, quite frankly, this afternoon's session really is, I think, a pinnacle of a planner where you're going to be able to work in a very collaborative way, coming up with some foundations for where we should go next in our pre-disaster planning, given this new normal that we find ourselves in. So thank you to FEMA, to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for the support of the work of BSP and the very effective, I think, and very progressive Coastal Zone Management Program. A long jewel, I think, in the list of programs and responsibilities of the government of Guam. If there is one thing Pacific Islanders are known for, it is resilience, particularly with the onset of typhoons and other disasters. But this past year has tested our resilience as a people in the face of a different natural hazard in COVID. And I'm proud of the resilience of Guam's people that have demonstrated in this crisis, as evidenced in the historic milestones achieved in testing and in vaccinations and in intervening and intercepting this pandemic. This resilience is also reflected in the broad public support for some of the most inconvenient but necessary restrictions to contain the disease, including this current mask mandate. However, we need more than just resilient people. We need to establish and maintain a resilient community. And by the way, this is where all of you come in. This kind of resilience comes from planning and investment to prepare for typhoons and other disasters. So there could not be anything more tailor-made for our situation than this very impressive agenda that has been organized for this part of the symposium. What I find impressive about the agenda is how much of it is focused on the practical applicability of the session scheduled today. For example, there are breakout sessions scheduled on recovery support functions, focusing on the areas of economic recovery, health and social services recovery, and community planning and capacity building. These sessions could not have come at a more opportune time, as staff from Homeland Security and several other agencies are right now in the process of preparing disaster recovery plans in these three areas, as well as for natural and cultural resources. By the way, this addition of an addendum or a program for natural and cultural resources is quite critical given the dynamic situation we find ourselves on this island. As with the states and territories across the country, we here in Guam are very interested in learning more about the funding opportunities in the American Rescue Plan, and consequently, I'm gratified that FEMA is going to help broaden our knowledge of the ARP. As we all know, the continuing challenge of climate change adds urgency to the task of ensuring these opportunities are taken full advantage of and not allowed to pass by. And speaking of climate change, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the professional, hardworking staff of FEMA, NOAA, and the U.S. Army Corps. In the face of political opposition in many corners to science and truth, a lot of the professional staff continued to try and do their job to make sure that we went forward and we were able to address at a very micro level at times, ways to catch up with some time that has been lost because of disagreements in politics. So to the staff and to the professional staff, I do want to say thank you for being steadfast and doing what you needed to do, shrug off some of the politics, focus on the policy. I just wanted to maybe talk about maybe some of the dynamic things I'm seeing on the island outside of this planning process that you'll have this afternoon, which is going to safeguard how we live. But there is quite a lot of excitement, and I just have to say that one of the projects that I see that many of you in the room might not be knowledgeable of, I think GCC President Mary Okada for sure knows, there's a very long-term educational longitudinal study that was launched last year in the midst of the pandemic, which is going to be studying for a long period of time the educational development of our children. From middle school through high school, they're monitoring cohorts and seeing what works, measuring how the environment, including the family structure, is aiding or in some cases limiting education achievement. This is going to be critical when we go and push forward on certain kinds of funds. I want to also say about Dr. Okada is here. I'll just say GCC has these boot camps. If you don't know what a boot camp is, she has been identifying people who are underemployed or unemployed or just recently graduating from high school and giving them the foundation to pursue fields of study in any one of the vocations. Last week, I was able to speak to a group you might be happy about, engineering technicians. These are people that are in particular wanting to follow and look about land surveying, going out and doing field work that is so necessary for the work you're doing. Also excited about the revamping and the modernization of Guam's long talked about and much ridiculed at times building permit and business license process. And in this regard, the governor and I named a task force that came up with a whole bunch of recommendations that our Director of Revenue and Taxation, Daphne Shimizu, and our Director of Public Works, Vince Ariola, are working to. And for you planners, we are going to be embracing technology to ensure that there is concurrent review of permit applications so that it's responsive to the applicants, but also be responsive to planners, making sure that we have documents and resources online and available and to limit the response and wait times from the agencies. On the education front again, I'm not sure how many of you have kids. You might have seen, if you're a fan of PBS, you might see that we have a pretty awesome PBS University program where we managed to identify so much talent in the Guam public school system to create and expand virtual learning resources. And this PBS University, by the way, is on its way to being nationally recognized as a very effective educational assistance program. Department of Agriculture is doing phenomenal work on Cocos Island, trying to recover our native Guam rail, the koku bird population, and also testing different interdiction efforts with our most infamous foreigner, the brown tree snake. The Commission for the Chamorro language are expanding Chamorro curriculum, and guess what? For those of you who have kids or grandkids that do Minecraft, we're gonna have Chamorro Minecraft. It's a partnership with Microsoft that in particular is looking at helping languages that are in danger to revamping them. And in that, we'll be able to introduce a lot of Guam and Chamorro cultural values as part of that programming. A lot of that being funded by the governor's Education Assistance and Youth Empowerment Grant Program. And last week, we're so happy that we pushed out $37.9 million to public organizations, educational organizations, and nonprofit organizations in over 70 projects. Not to mention that we have significant expansion and modernization of facilities at both the Port Authority and the airport. It is a very dynamic time, and the discipline of planning is in great demand. We find ourselves in the government and in the private sector competing for talent. So I just wanted to say, can I just see a raise? How many of you are GovGuam employees? Can you raise your hand? How many of you had summer youth employees this year? Well, I tell you what, I was over at Public Works when they were cycling out. This is, by the way, the first return of a summer youth program in 20 years. I was a summer youth intern. Guess what? I was 15 years old. I worked for Senator Madeline Bordallo. By the way, this is probably how I got into politics, because I got recruited to run for the Youth Congress. But I met this young gentleman, a young man who was a new graduate of high school. And I met him at Public Works, and I was asking him how his experience was. And he was assigned to the Guam Highway Office. And so he told me that before he got the internship, he was thinking of, he's going off island to college, of going after a aeronautics career, a discipline. But after he was at the Guam Highway Office, he told me that he's since changed his mind, at least for now, and he wants to study engineering, and he wants to work at the Guam Highway Office because he understands all the importance of the work that goes in that area, but he also sees the opportunity. And so next year, this program will return. I know when I see Randy, I was asking Randy Romero from Public Works how his interns did. He was very happy. In many cases, a lot of agencies caught up in a whole backlog of administrative work. Backlog in files, backlogged in data inputting into whatever system they're using. And the interns, majority of them in high school, were able to get into it. The level of enthusiasm was very high. So I encourage you next year, and already maybe, I think if I'm reading this right, I'm not sure if we're gonna keep up with the demand from the agencies. So kind of plan your time, but I mentioned that because it's so important for you to mentor younger people, to get them into this field, to get them activated. There's a whole bunch of learning, and I don't think there's anything we could have taught them in the school system that they experienced and learned when they were in the job site this summer. And then finally, I just want to say that all of this, and there's also a big movement that you might, some of you might be a part of. I know Brent Weesey is, and Vince, and the Guam Green Growth. So the Guam Green Growth, Dr. Okada is too, it is the largest public-private partnership our island has ever had. The Guam Green Growth was developed to pursue Guam's future in adopting and attaining each one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. We convened this group pre-pandemic, and through the pandemic continued our progress to identify action areas. We even had a rating system we got from Banji Lujan over at Waterworks to really be honest about how practical we could be in achieving projects. Do we have resources to accomplish them? What are important but are lacking resources that we can try and pursue? And I mentioned this, and that engagement is particularly, I think, important. And you'll see that in the explanation and the engagement on the recovery plan, or the Recovery Act, the Biden administration has come up with different pockets of funding for programs that have long been ignored. Areas in climate resilience, areas in addressing the ecology of different parts of this country, areas that are going to advance renewable energy, including renewable energy policy, areas that are going to address coastal threats to coastal zones, threats to rivers and streams, to bridges, to collaborative efforts in keeping transportation lines open between states and territories. So it is a dynamic time, and I would just say this, there's quite a lot of innovation out there in the agencies and quite a long list of projects that are in need of attention and certainly in need of funding. This is the time to dust those off and to refine what your plans are and to test them to the realities we face today, to be very balanced and practical, but to be very motivated. Because I don't think we're gonna see this level of attention given to some of these disciplines that have long been forgotten for many, many more years. It is a reason, I think, that you should feel good about the work that you're doing and just know that there's going to be a tremendous opportunity for you in the future. And so the last recommendation I have, Tyrone and to Edwin, is if you notice, this planning symposium, this conference continues to evolve. And I really would like to see maybe next year, maybe adding another day or incorporating an innovation hub. And I think this is important because there's a tremendous amount of work going on already, both in the public and the private sector, that is not taking notice. We don't have an opportunity sometimes to know what the innovative ways are or the projects that are going on. In fact, this afternoon, I'm very grateful that our visitors from Washington State are going to be with the Director of Public Works going down to make some smart recommendations about dealing with loss of coastal zone in Agate, in Umatic, in Alahan, and Molesu. There's a lot of challenges, but there's also quite a number of opportunities. So I'd just like to thank you for your time. Encourage you to, again, mentor younger people, find the talent. In fact, I think maybe part of that innovation hub might be an open door to the students up at the university and the college that are interested in this area, not only to interact with the professionals, but to take a look at what's happening and for them to imagine what role they may play in solving or providing for an excellent future. I thank you very much, and Colby, looking forward to your presentation. Welcome to Guam. Thank you.
Up next, the keynote address was presented by Colby Stanton, Director of Readiness from FEMA Region 9.
Colby Stanton is the current chair of the Pacific Risk Management Ohana and serves as Director of Readiness of the Pacific Area Office for the Department of Homeland Security, better known as FEMA, in Region 9. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, take it away, Ms. Colby Stanton. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm actually here in two roles. I am representing FEMA, but also the Pacific Risk Management Ohana. I should say, as always, as a federal employee, any bad jokes are my own. I'll try to stop myself from inflicting those on you. We're very excited to have you here, and we're very grateful to the help of the Bureau of Statistics and Plans and GovGuam in helping us put this on. For many of you, this is probably the first meeting you've had. It certainly is for me, the first conference that I've been able to attend since all of this pandemic stuff happened. And we're really excited to be here to talk about the importance of integrated recovery planning. Next slide. First, I wanted to say a little bit about the Pacific Risk Management Ohana. This is our first time meeting in Guam in many years, and so many of you may not be familiar with it. We were first formed actually in 2003 under a different name, and we really focus on partnerships, the importance and the role of partnerships in moving forward in bringing people and organizations together to make progress towards our common goals, to make communities in the Pacific more resilient. We have over 100 organizational partners, and we're guided by an executive council known as the Navigators Council that's composed of leadership from agencies and organizations like FEMA, like NOAA, the National Weather Service, the Office for Coastal Management, and the National Climatic Data Center are all represented on the Navigators Council. USGS, the University of Hawaii, the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, you saw Carl Kim for those of you who were here yesterday, and Island Insurance are all parts of the Navigators Council. My favorite description of what Primo does is that we don't do anything. We make what you do better. There's an outcome statement you can never measure. But I think it's true. I'm sorry, what was it? The erudite Ty yesterday said that it takes a community, and as a community we can make progress. And I think that that's very true, and that's really what Primo is all about. Taking advantage of the knowledge and the energy of the Pacific and helping people make connections so that we can make progress. Next slide. We do that in two different ways. The first is through our HUI, which is Hawaiian for work groups, essentially. Next slide. And we have actually now 6. We're still building our final one, building resilient communities. Unfortunately, we're trying to get that off the ground basically during the pandemic. And what I personally have found during the pandemic is it's great. It's been very possible to use Zoom to continue partnerships and relationships. It's been harder to set them up, but we are definitely interested in members who are willing and interested in working towards the idea of building resilience. Our other HUI are more established. We have one that works on communications, improving the communications infrastructure, both for alert and warnings and for sharing resilience information. We have a new one, again, around health security, looking to prepare and build the infrastructure to minimize transboundary movement of public health threats. We have a group dedicated to indigenous knowledge and the environment, making sure that while we use science, we use it respectfully and understanding the indigenous knowledge and the traditional knowledge that already exists in the Pacific. We also have a group dedicated to improving accessibility and usability of risk management data and products. And then a training and education and research group that really looks at trying to build collaborative training efforts across the Pacific. Next slide. The other ways that we do work is really through our events. And events like this one are platforms to learn from each other, discuss ongoing initiatives, and plan for safer, more sustainable Pacific communities. Our 2020 conference, you can see there, just before the pandemic, it was actually my last meeting before we went into lockdown, was built around the theme of building a resilient Pacific. Those conferences are held roughly every other year, and they're more structured, formal conferences with breakout sessions and tracks. Next slide. And in between, in the off years, what Primo has started trying to do is to have smaller meetings that are really based around specific communities. We really enjoy these platforms. We think that they're a great way to bring together knowledge and information. But we wanted to try to help specific communities around the Pacific. And we started in American Samoa in 2019, actually around the 10th anniversary of their devastating tsunami of 2009, to talk about recovery there. Back then, in 2019, we thought we were being brilliant and insightful in calling it pre-covery. The idea being, let's think ahead of time about how we recover from disasters. At the time, American Samoa was grappling with the recovery from Tropical Storm Gita. We actually had 2 counties in Hawaii dealing with smaller disaster recoveries. And then we had, obviously, the CNMI grappling with the recovery from first Sudalore and then U2, both devastating for their economy and communities. So at the time, we were talking about weaving a path to pre-covery in American Samoa. Next slide. And Edwin Reyes happily was there and said, hey, could we do this in Guam? Again, at that time, we were really talking about pre-covery and the importance of planning ahead to take advantage of the knowledge and capabilities of the community to plan ahead for the key decisions you're going to have to make following a disaster. So we started planning, and then the pandemic. So while we originally were calling this pre-covery, unfortunately now we're really talking about recovery. Around the Pacific, we are in the midst of a recovery. And we've built our agenda today to try to help you understand both some of the resources that are available for the COVID recovery, but then also the threats and the challenges that you'll have if you have a devastating typhoon, natural disaster that you have to recover from. Obviously, Guam is very hardened. You've made a lot of progress in terms of typhoon recovery or hardening and resilience. But even with all of that hardening, there are threats. And so the panel that'll be following me and Michelle will be talking more about the challenges that you might face and how you might come together to respond to them. Next slide, please. The key to what Primo wanted to bring is that, unfortunately, like all things, preparation helps you do better when you have to actually implement the task. You know, I think it's Mike Tyson who said, you know, everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the mouth. But the reality is, even if the plan doesn't perfectly prepare you, it prepares you better than not preparing at all. And that's what we were really seeing as Primo back in the end of 2018, early 2019, is that our jurisdictions were grappling with challenges in the midst of disaster that pre-planning would have helped them deal with. You know, establishing clear leadership roles, understanding who is responsible for what after a major disaster happens, making sure that you have an organizational structure that welcomes partnership, that welcomes stakeholders. You know, that we've got a lot of phrases for what's really stovepipes in our government, where we have lines of effort that aren't always good at reaching across to involve the stakeholders and integrate overlapping efforts. And it's critical in a recovery, and I'll talk a little bit more about why, that you engage all of the stakeholders moving in a single direction. We also want to engage and enable state leadership to leverage the capabilities that you have and improve your capabilities for understanding the onslaught of challenges and resources that will come following a disaster. To, as I said, promote that unity of effort and pull in a single direction. Next slide. So, a well-managed recovery will take advantage of pre-disaster partnerships, allow you to leverage your available resources, establish guidance for the transition from response to recovery. In the pandemic case, maybe transition back to the response before you go back to recovery. And that final bullet is really the most critical one. Plan for the surging personnel demands post-disaster. It's exactly what you're dealing with now. Unfortunately, with disasters, you get a lot more challenges, but not a lot more people. And so it's absolutely critical that everybody has a role, everybody's role is being implemented in tandem, and then again, you're not wasting time and resources by having two people, for example, do very similar jobs in different agencies without taking advantage of the work of each other. Next slide. So, what we have to offer is called the National Disaster Recovery Framework. It's a national document that was created to try to provide that structure and framework to allow you to take advantage of your existing capabilities, but to leverage them more effectively following a catastrophic disaster. We've taken advantage of the lessons learned from disasters across the country prior to its development to really provide a first step towards achieving that common understanding of your goals and how to implement your processes to get there. It's just a tool, however. It will not be successful without all of your input. And that's why I'm so excited for this afternoon. One of the things that I think Primo does best is to try to bring together people from all different kinds of areas to provide their input around common challenges and develop outcomes. And so may I dare say it, I'm hopeful that this afternoon is even a little bit fun for those of you participating either in person or online. It's an opportunity for you to provide your insights to how you want to see Guam recover in these three areas. The next slide, please. But as good as it is just a framework. It's not a plan. It provides you in Guam with the structure to develop your own plans for what you want your recovery to look like. The framework defines roles and responsibilities, suggests personnel roles, promotes the establishment of some organizations to manage recovery, promotes a deliberate process, but it's only as good as the input you bring to it. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned these these core concepts a couple of times. Leadership, you know, it's absolutely critical, and I'm so grateful to the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor yesterday for really being here and underscoring the importance of this community effort. The recovery core capabilities, the idea that there are certain tasks that you're going to have to do that you have to be prepared to implement together. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the recovery support functions that are really how you organize to implement those tasks. And then again, unfortunately, we are really in the midst of post-disaster or mid-disaster recovery planning. But this is also our opportunity for pre-disaster recovery planning for that next typhoon. As Brandon will be talking about on our panel, Guam has been relatively lucky over the past few years. We've had a lot of near misses. I was here actually for Mangkhut a couple of years ago as we watched Rhoda take a devastating blow. You know, very limited number of miles away, and yet, you know, we had some strong winds, there was some water, but really got lucky. And that's just one example. You know, Wu-Tip could have been devastating. And, you know, unfortunately, at some point, the luck has to stop. I need to knock on wood as I say that. I'm very happy with luck, but luck, hope, is not a plan, as we say in Hawaii. So the next slide. I mentioned before, a framework is really needed to understand the connections and unify efforts. Cylinders of excellence are never a great thing. You know, you always want all of your pieces of your community recovery, of your community planning to work together. But it's even more critical following a disaster when, like today, you have the influx of money from the federal government, you have an overwhelming challenge in front of you, you have very limited personnel time to deal with the challenges that you have. And in some ways, you have an opportunity to decide what you want Guam to look like, not just tomorrow, but 10 or 20 years from now. Because some of the investments that you're making, some of the decisions that you're making, are really going to potentially remake Guam. And so it's critically important that groups, for example, that are talking about the community and the economic development needs are also talking to the people that are making the decisions about housing or health and social services, are also talking to your infrastructure decision makers, are also talking to the people who are making decisions about what facilities your community needs. You only have a limited amount of money. It seems like a lot. Michelle will talk about those sources, but it is limited. It's finite. And so making sure that all of those pieces are working together is absolutely critical to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your island. Next slide, please. So the 6 federal recovery support functions are meant to help you make those connections, but not alone. They're grouped by coordinating federal agencies that have the most responsibility and the most capability in those areas. So FEMA has the lead for community planning and capacity building. And you'll shortly hear from Michelle Beasley, who can talk to you more about, you know, that area in particular. Department of Commerce is in charge of economic recovery, Health and Human Services in charge of health and social services. Housing is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is in charge of infrastructure systems. And then Department of the Interior is in charge of natural and cultural resources. Now, Guam has committed under some of your grants to try to make the fastest progress under 3 particular areas: community planning and capacity building, economic recovery, and health. And so that's why for this afternoon's sessions, we've really focused on those 3. I encourage you, though, those of you who are going to the community planning and capacity building session, we're going to try to make sure that we include some of the other topics such as housing and natural and cultural resources in those as well. So if you feel like, you know, you're not quite sure where to go, you don't fit into the others, but you're interested in those topic areas, please, we'll talk again about this later, but please stick around anyway. Go to the community and planning and capacity building, and we'll make sure that we integrate you into that effort. Next slide. So again, the plan isn't, well, the framework is just a framework. It is a tool to help you progress. And so that's why I wanted to bring this slide to you, so that you're aware that you can make your own decisions about how you want to structure. So if you look at the state of Hawaii, you'll see where they started from with the National Disaster Recovery Framework, but they've made a couple of different decisions. Knowing what their needs are, they decided to separate health and social services into separate RSFs, for example. They made the same decision about cultural resources and natural resources, largely because the stakeholder bases are not entirely overlapping, and they felt that they could streamline their efforts. You should feel the same to do that here, if need be. So again, you know what Guam needs. What PRIMO is trying to do, what the National Disaster Recovery Framework is trying to do, is to provide you a structure. And so today, we'll be talking about the resources available to help you with your recovery, The scope of the issues and the demands will help you identify with our next panel, help you identify where you want to be, what success looks like to you, and then what your ideas are for how we can get there. Next slide. Mostly, I want to encourage you that despite how big the challenges are, I don't want you to despair. We know that the community can handle this challenge, and you are not alone. Michelle gave me a hard time because I put a picture of her on my slide. She'll be speaking shortly, and she's actually sticking around for the next week, hoping to build on what you all provide as input now over the next week to help you make the next steps in your planning effort. The other picture that I have there, you may not recognize. Deanne Criswell is the current administrator of FEMA. To my knowledge, it's the first time that we have a FEMA administrator who's not only our first woman administrator, she's also responded to a disaster in Guam. That's a picture of her in Guam when she was here for Typhoon Dolphin. So we have leadership in FEMA who understands the challenges of responding to disasters in the far Pacific, understands the tyranny of distance and how difficult it is to respond, and how important your resilience is to ensure that we all can recover from disasters here. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your active participation over the rest of the day.
Thank you very much. Fantastic, awesome presentation. Kobe Stanton, Director of Readiness Pacific Area Office, FEMA Region 9.
Up next, remarks from Michelle Beasley, Federal Disaster Recovery Officer from FEMA's Region 9 on the American Rescue Plan.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michelle Beasley.
Thank you. Really super glad to be here half a day, Guam. Thank you so much for an incredible welcome. Want to really thank Colby Stanton for giving me the preface of really being able to lean in more deeply around where our National Disaster Recovery Framework can be a space that we enter into as Guam thinks about recovery from one disaster to the next. So a big part of what I hope to walk through in this presentation today is to set the stage. Set the stage of how COVID-19 has impacted the island of Guam, has impacted both the continent, mainland, and then also a variety of the territories and states that are in the Pacific. It's perhaps maybe the biggest disruptor as a disaster that we've seen globally in a really long time. And as a result, the recovery is going to also take a really long time. But there is some hope, and I really do love the words of the Lieutenant Governor as he thinks about innovation hubs, about a lot of the ideas that can come together from a community to really think about their own recovery and how they themselves can really help move their own needles to really, build something better and stronger and more resilient. So I'm going to set the stage. Next slide, please. One more. So this is a really interesting visualization. And I call it the pandemic recovery continuum. So on the left-hand side, of this, you see this little green rectangle, preparedness. And then typically a disaster will happen. And after a disaster, which usually is a very defined event with a start and a stop, then, the communities will come together and really think about how do we need to respond? How are we going to come together to recover? And then, is there any sort of long-term perspective that we need to continue to support that recovery? Well, COVID-19 has really disrupted the traditional nature of recovery and response and how that affects communities. And what you see down at the lower part of this graph is the COVID-19 pandemic started, but it hasn't stopped yet. It just keeps going. And so it's been this very difficult interplay that we live in where we are both responding and recovering every single day. And so it makes this process, this uncharted territory difficult to think through how to bring together the resources to keep our communities safe, but then to also bring together the resources to be able to move forward into the future. So with that, next slide. What ended up happening was a timeline, and I'm going to go through this timeline for you. Our Congress really did acknowledge the fact that no one had seen a pandemic at this scale across the entire country. And so our Congress, actually, both the Senate and the House, began to pass a series of legislation. And that legislation essentially allowed us the opportunity to begin to respond quickly. So in March 6th, we started seeing bills come through with funding. And that funding that most folks are familiar with is CARES Act funding. CARES Act was huge. It was unprecedented to actually see that Congress understood that every state and every territory would be slightly different in their needs. And as a result, they went ahead and they allowed the states fiscal funds in order to be able to respond appropriately to their own communities around the pandemic. And then we continued to see more legislation in the spring, but really last spring in 2020 was focused on response. Heavy response. Let's keep our communities safe. And then what happened was in the late fall, December, and then early this spring, Congress actually did a wonderful thing. They said, we now need to begin to move out of the response phase, and we really need to move into this recovery phase, which means we're going to allocate dollars specifically for recovery and not response. In emergency management, we oftentimes speak about response and how we can very quickly mobilize what we need to be able to move through. And the recovery definitely takes more time. So the biggest new piece of legislation that was passed to really, again, help infuse the support needed for our territories and our tribal nations and our states was the American Rescue Plan Act. Next slide. And if we kind of look at the themes of where some of this money really began to go, you'll begin to see, actually, that it was supporting small businesses and economic stimulus payments. We were focusing on public health and tax incentives. We were focusing on educational support because everything got disrupted. So our whole way of living life really also became disruptive. And what we began to see was that CARES Act really helped kind of lean in to sort of jumpstart some programs. And the American Rescue Plan not only continues to infuse money into those programs, but they also have been offering additional assistance. And when you total that assistance together, $5.3 trillion in 18 months is pretty unprecedented. Next slide. Next slide. So funding the road to recovery. Before I go into the details of ARPA, one of the things I want to bring up is recovery coordination. And what does that really mean? So what you're going to see in this VIN chart is some of our key areas, the built and natural environment, economic, social, and political. And that really showcases how an entire community can come together. And it reminds me of an event that I went to over 20 years ago, which was the International HIV/AIDS Conference in Durban, South Africa. And that was specifically focusing on an epidemic, not a pandemic, but an epidemic around HIV/AIDS. And at that point, in that conference, it was the very first time that conference had ever been held in a developing country, in a space where the epidemic was really impacting the African continent in a huge way. And there had never been a human face to the epidemic. And it was that moment where we actually saw that human face and how communities were being impacted. And I feel like we're in similar waters with COVID-19. There's a very human face and a very human impact on how this pandemic is affecting our communities. And that's why the coordination from a community level is so important. Next slide. So COVID-19 recovery funding. Again, we're really blessed to have Congress come together, our leaders, really identify the importance of how funding can help lean in on any community that's been hit by the pandemic, which is a global pandemic. And for COVID-19, what you're going to find is that there's a variety of different funding buckets. So we have CARES Act, we have FEMA funding, we have interagency competitive block funding and grants, we have the American Rescue Plan Act, which includes the Fiscal Fund and Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund. We also have on the horizon the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Bill, which is going to help infuse. And the reason why I put this graph here is because I begin to show the overlapping of where this funding can come together to really help build out and move programs and projects that can help the community heal more quickly around their recovery efforts. So next slide. The American Rescue Plan Act. So let's do a deep dive. This deep dive really showcases that $4.5 billion was allocated out to the U.S. territories. This was under what's called the Coronavirus State and Local Recovery Fiscal Fund. And what we saw were that territories were going to have some of their funding allocations divided equally. There were some equations based on population. And you began to see that breakdown also in states and tribal nations. So if we think about the Pacific, we know that Hawaii also was going to be given big allocations to be able to move through some of their recovery resources. And not only to mention that, but tribal nations which have been incredibly impacted by this pandemic. Next slide. So what does this look like for the Pacific? Since we're really here for Primo, and this is really about how do we organize regionally around planning efforts that can really help prepare how we move forward in the future. Hawaii definitely is going to see a huge infusion through what this coronavirus state and local fiscal funds. And you can begin to see on this slide just where those funds are going to come down, how they're going to be allocated, and then eventually what needs to happen. The beautiful thing here is that we have time. That's the wisdom. So the funds don't need to be spent tomorrow. The funds just need to be allocated within the next 2 years. And then there's time to begin to actually pull together those projects and move forward the implementation of those projects. The funds don't need to be spent until 2024. So this is really good. It's going to help bolster economics. It's also going to help bolster our public health infrastructure and health and human social services. Next slide. Eligible use. So we can support our health expenditures. I know that the governor has an incredible vision to really revamp this idea of a medical facility that is going to be an icon for the region. Additionally, addressing negative economic impacts caused by the COVID emergency. And then really I want to highlight we have the opportunity to use some of these funds to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So these are great opportunities to really think forward thinking and to think about what kinds of projects are really going to help build and bolster this community. Next slide. So ARPA state and local fiscal funds timeline, as I said, expenses really started clicking and beginning on March 3rd of 2001. The funds just need to be obligated by December 31st of 2024, and then the funds need to be spent by 2026. But the lesson here is this isn't just about a whole lot of money. This is also about the wisdom of how to use that money and to spend it and think about it appropriately. So, next slide. If we begin to look at the distribution methods, we know that there's a lot of individual relief. There's some flexibility for that local fiscal fund. There's a lot of formula funds to the states and territories and nonprofits, and then there's also going to be competitive funds. Those are the competitive grants that actually are eligible, and you'll begin to actually see how this pie chart pulls together how this money will be seen and felt within a community. Next slide. Additionally, the American Rescue Plan Act allows in their eligibility rules to help build up the resource capacity of a local territory, a state, a tribal nation. So the really good news is that you don't have to do this alone. And that's a very important piece here. You can actually bring in the consultants, the attorneys, the accountants, even the data analytics folks, and engineers, and especially, I think it's pretty important to bring in the project managers and the planners that can really help guide the community in how they want to move forward in their program and project development. Next slide. Additionally, there are a lot of opportunities in infrastructure, and I know that there are a lot of ideas in Guam around how to bolster infrastructure. Broadband, for example, has an extraordinary opportunity. More than 3 billion, excuse me. 3 billion, I feel trillion, billion, we just have so much money, it's hard to even keep track. But $3 billion through NTIA to really begin to help build out that broadband infrastructure. What does that really mean? It means that you have the opportunity to think about how telemedicine will work in your healthcare facilities, how you can build those innovation community hubs that you're really interested in, being able to share ideas across the globe with other innovators, the ability to work differently than we ever have before. A lot of us have had that experience of working from home and hybrid work between the office and home and wherever you might be. Additionally, communications, especially emergency communications. Schools, a lot of our kids had to do Zoom homework, and that was not an easy task to manage while also working a full-time job. So all of these things were leaning on something that really hadn't been very mature, and that's broadband. Next slide. I kind of want to begin to wind down this conversation with another story. And this story is actually takes me back to 2006 when I had the opportunity, living in Portland, Oregon, to work with Oregon Health Science University on what I call public health innovation story. And I'm going to walk you through each of these 3 lanes. The first lane is that the actual university, it's up on a hill. So if anyone's been in Portland, Oregon, they know that OHSU, the entire campus is up on a hill. And the campus was growing, but they didn't have any more space to actually put buildings, to grow and to innovate and to do what they wanted to do in the future. So they really made the investment to purchase land by the waterfront along the river, and they said, we're going to be the first medical facility in the entire United States to be certified LEED Platinum. Pretty amazing, pretty bold. And what that meant was they not only needed to have a great innovative design, but they also needed to work with both public and private partners to be able to make this happen. A big part of this was how they were going to connect the higher campus up on a hill down to the river. And they really had this great innovative idea to build a tram, but they couldn't do it themselves. So they actually worked with the city and the state legislature and public bonds to actually focus on investing in building that tram. And that was fantastic. So here they had this LEED certified building. They had a tram in Oregon, which was amazing. Looks at Mount Hood. It's pretty beautiful. And then they had a realization. They realized that in the design of that building, they forgot where they were going to put storage for all of their medical health records for all of their patients. And they had a, oh my God moment. And in that oh my God moment, there was a doctor who really believed that it was an opportunity to bring in medical informatics and to bring in the electronic medical health record, EPIC. I was actually on that project for many years, the EPIC project, but it was a $75 million just mishap. They didn't actually build that into the budget. So there was a lot of wrangling that needed to happen. And the transformation that EPIC brought with the transformation of being a lead building, having a tram connected, was transformational for Portland, Oregon. It really helped build a new identity for how Portland, Oregon was moving into the future. And I leave you with that because if you can think with good design, with innovative partnerships, and with how to use technology and bring it together, you yourselves can really bring innovative identity to the island of Guam. Next slide. So for those of you that are sometimes thinking, how are others using these funds, these ARPA state fiscal funds? There's actually a website out there that allows you to identify how other states and territories and tribes are using both their legislature and also their ability to use their executive powers to build out projects. And I would just encourage you to go ahead and take a look at some of the projects around innovation and around how these groups are partnering with others to really help move their own future. Next slide. My last thoughts, I would just say, in today's later activities that we're gonna have around recovery support functions, think about how you're gonna build capacity. This is really a very important point in time to think about that. Also, strategy. A lot of us need to actually take a step back and think about the bigger canvas and the bigger picture and how we all fit together. Take some time to design, plan, and bring in voices from other spaces and places, because sometimes you're gonna have that $75 million amiss. So I just highly recommend to think through some of this. And then additionally, feel free to reach out to me and to my team in FEMA. We help run the Interagency Recovery Coordination Group. The Interagency Recovery Coordination Group focuses on connecting the dots across the entire federal family. So we're really working on trying to build unity and alignment across the federal family with Small Business Alliance, USDA, the Department of Interior, EPA, HUD, Health and Human Services, to begin to really align where we can help support programs and projects that communities need. And with that, next slide, please feel free to contact me with any other questions or concerns. And I thank you so much for your time and your attention. Take great care.